There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
There you have President Donald Trump confirming that the United States has significantly escalated conflict with Venezuela, with the CIA carrying out a drone strike on a port facility in Venezuela last week. This marks the first time the US has actually struck Venezuela on their territory. And the strike was carried out on a dock where US officials claim that the Tren de Aragua gang was storing narcotics that they suspected were going to traffic later. Now, they also told the New York Times that no one on the dock, there was no one on the dock at the time, so no one was killed. But honestly, anything claimed by the Trump administration at this point, especially in regard to Venezuela, should be taken with a grain of salt, since they have been caught lying again and again. But so far, we haven't heard or seen any type of response from Venezuela. Before I give you more details, though, Cenk, your 2 cents.
Yeah, it's still a huge mystery who's driving this war against Venezuela. But at least now we know we're bombing them alongside Somalia, Nigeria, potentially Iran soon. We have a poll up on tyt.com asking you, what's the dumbest place to bomb? So check that out when you get a chance. But certainly Venezuela is high on the list. Let's find out more.
So the Times also reported that the CIA has allegedly developed intelligence on a number of purported drug facilities in Venezuela and Colombia as part of the planning for an expanded campaign. So this is a little bit of foreshadowing information, right? That this could expand into more strikes on Venezuela. And to your point, Cenk, the Trump administration, this anti-war president has bombed like 6 different countries in his second term. It hasn't even been 12 months yet. It's insane. Now, this attack comes after the US continues striking random fishing boats suspected of trafficking drugs. The New York Times published a pretty damning expose on some of the damage that's been caused. And there's been one instance in which they think they might have found marijuana, but when it comes to the global drug trade, Venezuela is not a major player. If anything, they traffic cocaine, but even in that regard, it is a tiny percentage of the cocaine trade in the United States. The US military also launched its 30th strike on a fishing boat this week on Monday. The US has also been seizing Venezuelan oil tankers. Now, the latest killing bring the total number of people extrajudicially executed by the US military at sea to 107. Now, again, the Pentagon has failed to provide a shred of evidence to the American people, proving that they are in fact going after, narco terrorists, a phrase or word that they kind of made up in order to drum up support for their military operations. And even if those boats were supposedly trafficking drugs to the United States, again, no evidence of that. Those boats can't even reach the United States. We don't just extrajudicially murder people, especially when it comes to drugs, right? Like there's usually, you intercept, you ask some questions. If they're trying to traffic drugs, you bring them to justice in a different way. You don't just kill people, everyone on a boat. Now, the regime change is really what the Trump administration wants. Now, they don't say that publicly, but privately they have said it time and time again. And in fact, the chief of staff for the White House, Susie Wiles, admitted as much during an interview with Vanity Fair, saying that President Trump wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle, meaning Nicolas Maduro. And people way smarter than me on that say that he will. However, if you just check in with Venezuela, you will see that Nicolas Maduro seems to be, I'm sure it's all for show, but he's putting on like a cheery face. He has no intention of stepping down despite the US military buildup off the coast of Venezuela, despite the fishing boats being struck, despite the oil tankers being seized. He remains steadfast in staying in power. and has offered the Trump administration pretty much everything they want in regard to oil reserves. But clearly that's not what the Trump administration is really out for. They want regime change. And for someone like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, this is also very much ideological.
So here's what we know and what we don't know. Number one, we know it's not about the drugs. Donald Trump Jr.'s nose holds more drugs than Venezuela does. So if you bought into that hype, you got totally lied to, and you should be furious at whichever host you're watching that's feeding you those lies. Simple Google search, ask Grok, anything will tell you that Venezuela is a very, very small supplier of drugs. That is not the reason why we're going to Venezuela. And so, by the way, the fact that they're 100% lying about the reason should give you pause for concern. Why are they lying to you? Why don't they tell us what the actual reason is? Well, obviously, they don't want to share the actual reason. So that leads us to speculate. Oil is the number one guess, logically so, largest oil reserve in the world. We almost always attack countries with large oil reserves and no way to protect themselves. So that's why we're partly mental about no one else getting nukes. So later, if they have natural resources, we or Israel or a combination of us can attack them and take their natural resources, and they won't be able to defend themselves. Okay, so that's great strategy. But the problem here is, so that would solve the mystery and we'd be done with it. The problem here is that the oil companies are saying, we don't really want to spend more money developing the oil in Venezuela. Trump is almost pressuring them to do it. Richard Grenell, working for Trump, actually got a deal from Maduro saying, yeah, we'll turn over all our oil to the Americans because he wanted to stay in power. But that didn't do the job. So here's the third thing we know. We definitively want regime change. Now, if we already are getting their oil at whatever price ExxonMobil, Chevron, et cetera wants, why do we need regime change? Don't forget, Noble Mobile is saving you a ton of money. So a lot of people are signing up now and beginning to realize, what the hell, why am I paying so much to Verizon and AT&T? So your bill's only $50 a month, but it can actually be less because they give you money back if you don't use your data. So if you're paying more than $50, there's no reason to not switch. It's crazy not to switch because same phone, same number, same contacts, literally nothing changes. TYT.com/switch, TYT.com/switch. All right, we'll be right back. Well, there's only two reasons why we'd want regime change. One is Marco Rubio is obsessed with toppling the Cuban government. He thinks the Venezuelan government is backing them, so he's got to topple the Venezuelan government so he could topple the Cuban government. And the Cuban Americans and that diaspora here in America, to be honest, they can get mad all they like, are the closest thing we have to the pro-Israel cult in this country, right? So they're mental about, we have to, who cares about America? We have to topple Cuba by any means necessary. That's our number one priority. We don't have a second priority, right? So could that be it? Well, Marco Rubio's Secretary of State, so he's uniquely powerful in that case. Otherwise, that community has a little bit of power, but not overwhelming power. The second group that apparently wants to topple Venezuela, and the folks who are famous for insisting on regime change, are Israel. And Israel says they're working with Hamas and Hezbollah on a tiny little, slingshot program or whatever imagined scenario they've come up with for them to get panicked about it. And Israel believes that no one should ever be say that anybody who's been critical of Israel should ever have any arms, not just nukes, but you can't have ballistic missiles, you can't have drones, because that's what they say that Venezuela might be working with the Iranians on, et cetera. So no drones allowed, no nothing allowed, no weapons allowed, no rocks allowed, nothing. And you saw in that clip where Trump is talking about it like an idiot. It's a secret, covert CIA plan. You're not supposed to announce it to an international audience. But anyway, was it him or was it Netanyahu? Because Netanyahu is sitting there like a ventriloquist, smiling next to him, right? All right, so I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not saying it's Israel. I don't have enough evidence of that. It might just mainly be Rubio, or it's a combination of the two. But Anna, last thing that's clear is how painfully dumb this war is. Literally, right. No one in America wants it. We can't even figure out who the secret people are that want it, and yet we're somehow must go to another war.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's just, it flies in the face of everything that Trump promised on the campaign trail. And look, I'm not stupid. most people who campaign on things that they don't actually intend on fulfilling. But one of the areas that he really gave himself plaudits over was the fact that he didn't start any new wars during his first term. I mean, he certainly engaged in existing wars. He took Obama's drone war and expanded that, so much so that the collateral damage was so embarrassing to the US government that they stopped reporting on the number of civilian casualties tied to the drone wars. Look, if you paid close attention to Trump's first term, you would know that he's anything but a peace president. So none of this is surprising to me. But in regard to Israel, I don't think that Israel's the main driver of what Trump's administration is doing with Venezuela. But I do think the fact that, Venezuela is more hostile to Israel as opposed to a country like the United States has motivated Israel to vociferously support what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela. So much like Iraq, was Israel the main driver in pushing us to invade Iraq in 2003? Some might argue yes. I would say they were more taking advantage of the situation and egging the US on. And I think the same thing is happening here with Venezuela. Either way, it's stupid. And this is happening at a time where the United States is already struggling with $38 trillion in debt? All of this costs money. And so while programs that help our fellow Americans are getting slashed left and right, we're spending more money on bombs, an additional, $8 billion for Israel's jets. I mean, it's just crazy. So it really shows what the priorities are for our government, Cenk. They don't care about us. They care about continuing the enrichment of the defense contractors and basically spurring new wars in areas that we really shouldn't be involved in. So that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, my last point is, one, I'm gonna remind you about the poll. What's the dumbest country to bomb? Venezuela, Iran, Somalia, or Nigeria? That's on tyt.com. The reason I'm reminding you that is because the Venezuela bombing was done a little bit earlier this month. Nigeria and Somalia were bombed on Christmas Day. Somalia has been bombed 127 times. And after Netanyahu came, Trump talked about bombing Iran again on behalf of Israel. So Iran is winning there because this would be a bigger conflict, 92 million people, potentially disastrous war in the Middle East. But guys, the biggest takeaway from all of that is no matter who you vote for, you always get a neocon. Trump ran on anti-war. This is the most pro-war administration I've seen since Dick Cheney. But I mean, he's putting Dick Cheney to shame. Dick Cheney had to work super hard to get us to invade Iraq, right? And Trump doesn't work hard at all. He's invading, I think he's bombed about 8 countries so far. Doesn't ask anybody for permission, doesn't declare war through Congress, doesn't make a case. We can't even figure out why he's bombing Venezuela. And so he just does it anyway. So the real problem isn't any of this. The real problem is corruption. Because as long as we have bribery legalized in this country, you're always going to get a deeply corrupt president. It doesn't matter which party they're from, and they're always going to start wars and make you pay for it. And it's always going to be on behalf of someone else and not us. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated.